Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Best Piece Fiction, a social justice anthology. Edited by Robert Olen Butler and Phong Nguyen. Narrated by Tim Lounibos and Siiri Scott. Introduction. In an interview with Alexander Weinstein for Pleiades, Literature and Context, George Saunders said that a story is an oomph-making machine, or it's nothing at all. That measure for a story's success, does it have the power to move the reader, is one that I adhere to as a writer and editor, and one that the selection team applied meticulously when narrowing down the submissions for our guest editor, Robert Olen Butler. But we needed to be moved in a particular way, toward empathy, toward awareness, and toward humanity, especially the latter. In Creative Quest, Questlove wrote that effective creative endeavors demonstrate proof of life. At the core, we need to know that our art is not manufactured by, say, artificial intelligence, but that it is the actual product of one human appealing to another, whether directly or over a span of time and space. It is no surprise that humans appealing to one another would tell stories, and it is no surprise that they would tell stories about war and strife. But what is fascinating and unexpected are the manifold stories we tell about the periphery of war, the aftermath of war, the war raging within a self or a society, the unstable peace that we live in day to day, which we know to be built on a foundation of luck and privilege. Americans, in particular, have lived so long with the paradox of being outside the war zone themselves, yet as participants in a democracy, being complicit in war-making throughout the world, that we have become immune to its depiction. In screen media, violence is inherently aestheticized, and we live at a comfortable remove from the horrific events playing out before us. Therefore, we need a different approach in order to become aware of our peculiar place in the global scheme. Peace is a slippery, sometimes oily term. Like any vast abstraction, it can conjure up associations with soaring oratory, much of which is utilized to manipulate. It is particularly hollow in the mouths of politicians of all alignments, priests of all faiths, and gurus of all persuasions. Yet there is no better word in the English language for all that is not war. In this anthology, peace fiction means stories that are close enough to the fire to singe but not catch, depicting those moments when war is on our minds or in our hearts, not inflicted upon our bodies. It means not a war story or an anti-war story, but a story that reveals the ripples of war that move over the surface of all our lives. The concept of peace fiction is not naive. It is not a utopian project. This anthology modestly poses whether literature has any role in furthering the ongoing pursuit of peace. If such a thing is possible, it requires the imaginative energies of creators to realize a future capable of great empathy. At its best, literature provides us with both the model and the means for achieving it. These 14 stories are the most successful recent examples of such stories. Published in 2018 to 2019, they represent the current wave of fiction that looks outward and observes the world, rather than looking inward and repeating what we've already seen before. We hope this anthology will be the first in a series of biennial anthologies that will have a different guest editor each time. 40 semifinalists were selected by me and interns at the University of Missouri, based on open submissions and the copious reading of published literary journals. These included individual journals with emphasis in social justice and/or diversity, such as the Asian American issue of the Massachusetts Review, and the journal Obsidian, which is devoted entirely to works by authors of the African diaspora. These were then passed on to guest editor Robert Olen Butler, who selected 14 stories for inclusion in the anthology. We still have work to do to represent the true diversity of today's working writers. Future entries into the Best Piece Fiction Anthology will prioritize and center our diverse population of authors, hopefully including works that highlight issues that came to the fore since 2020, the BLM movement, indigenous rights, anti-Asian and anti-Muslim violence, and other issues that impact minoritized groups. Literary journals are well represented in this book. Kenyon Review has 2 stories. Plowshares has 4. The rest have appeared in Bellevue Literary Review, the Massachusetts Review, Iowa Review, the Missouri Review, Obsidian, London Magazine, or Witness. One story was selected from the story collection All the Names They Used for God by Anjali Sachdeva. In Coffins for Kids, Wendy Rawlings uses defamiliarization to reflect the absurdity of our 21st century reality, where school shootings are a common, even weekly occurrence, and where Second Amendment activists rationalize the massacre of children by leveling blame at everyone but the firearm manufacturers. It approaches peace from the uneasy position of living in a violent society where war is an undeclared ethos. All the Names for God by Anjali Sachdeva examines how the chaos of war swallows civilians and non-combatants and is inherently violent toward the innocent. The only peace to be achieved here is through the cathartic and fantastical exercise of dominance of will over the oppressor. Down to the Levant by Joshua Idashak conveys the texture of wartime in the periphery. Ada After the Bomb by Alicia Upano discusses the periphery of war in the long view throughout the mid to late 20th century. Miranda Gold's A Small Dark Quiet explores the intricacies of grief and possibilities of hope in the aftermath of war. In Dennis Wong's The Resurrection of Ma Jun, the plight of ethnic and religious minorities in China is depicted as a state of perpetual war. Camille F. Forbes reveals what a tautology War and Peace can be for slaves on a plantation during the Civil War. Dan Pope's Bon Voyage, Charlie gets into how integrity can be compromised by the distortions of truth that war requires. In A Woman with a Torch, Mark Powell explores the psychic violence of our contemporary moment, despite the persistent illusion of peace. And whereas L'Homme Blessé by Ron Rash shows the ambiguous legacy of war's victors, The Man on the Beach by Josie Sigler Sibara examines the legacy and inheritance of war's losing side, of history's villains. Letters Arrive from the Dead by Rachel Kadish takes a haunting and lyrical approach to its subject matter. It tells the story of what lingers on in the aftermath. The Blue River Hotel by Stephen Hennigan takes up the possibility of romantic love in wartime. Finally, The White Spot by Jonathan Blum registers the complexity of familial love in a time of strife. I would venture to guess that none of the stories included in this anthology were written merely to provoke, but their provocation is valuable. Being driven to action is a literary effect. The literary cosmos isn't merely divided into mirror stories, reflecting our lives as lived, and window stories, giving us access to exotic and distant vistas. There are water stories, too, which soak the reader in their brine and involve us deeply as participants in the narrative. Like the best stories out there, these 14 pieces are not consigned to a single effect, as Poe strived to evoke, but to a multiple effect. They cause us to feel, to think, and hopefully, to muster the will to act. Phong Nguyen, Editor.
Wendy Rawlings. Coffins for Kids. The gunman didn't like redheads, someone told Naomi afterward. The gunman didn't like redheads, okay, but he liked, I don't know what, blasting the brains of 7-year-olds across a wall map of the United States made out of construction paper? Spraying bullets at kids shoving coats inside lockers. Maybe he just didn't like maps of the United States. Maybe he had something against lockers. When he was a child, had he cut the heads off rodents? That was a thing, wasn't it? An indicator of something gone wrong early on? Naomi remembered her own childhood. stealing Malamars from her mother's stash, learning to masturbate using Barbie's legs, shoplifting a lipstick from Macy's. Maybe she wasn't the numero uno best child in America either, but growing up to blow away a bunch of second graders with a semi-automatic weapon, picking off redheads? Oh, and he also didn't like girls. So Emmeline had 2 strikes against her. If only Naomi had birthed a brown-eyed boy, now she and Rick and the brown-eyed boy could leave New England forever, go live in New Mexico and grow edible cacti, reinvent themselves, get permatans. But no. Now Emily, with her wrong gender, wrong hair, was in the market for a coffin. "Hey, Mom, could you get me a nice box to be buried in? All the other kids have one." Rick had suggested cremation, but what parent puts her kid in an oven? Not a half-Jewish parent, that's for sure. So, a nice box it would be. She Googled children's coffins. Up came an image of a tattooed guy wearing a safety mask and doing something with a blowtorch. Asterisked beside the photo were the words, "Free consultation with master craftsman Brock Honeycutt. We send your little angel to heaven in style." Naomi lingered on the site, scrolling down to a photo of the guy with his wife. His dark beard reached nearly to his shirt pocket. Why had he put "in style" in quotes? Maybe that was a trademarked phrase? The custom casket gallery showed coffins made to look like trains, like boats, like surfboards, like zebras. One had a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles face on the lid. Another had butterflies painted on it. Another was camouflage with a deer's head on top and attached to the side, a child-sized rifle. The sight of a firearm made Naomi gasp. She hadn't seen anything even resembling a gun since the Thursday Glenn Belson decided he didn't like redheads. The deer's head coffin could ship in 24 to 36 hours. She wondered if Brock Honeycutt took American Express. When Naomi was 13, her favorite cousin had died of leukemia. Watching her father and her uncle weep openly at the funeral, Naomi swore she would never have kids. Instead, she would have birds, maybe a dog. She liked lizards. But when she was 36, Rick convinced her to take the goalie out, as he put it, and half a year later she was pregnant. That a child could die of leukemia had made Naomi an atheist. Who was crazy enough to believe in a God who was a total shithead? But Emily's death, and the deaths of her classmates Paul and Eleanor, all parents these days, it seemed, named their kids Eleanor, made Naomi reevaluate her atheism. A gunman wearing chainmail shooting up a third-grade class? That could only mean a God did exist, and he was a total jerk. And why hadn't anyone stopped a guy wearing freaking chainmail from entering a third-grade classroom? "We thought he was doing a presentation on the Middle Ages," the principal told her and the other bereaved parents. Miss Oslansky wore polyester sheath dresses in primary colors with birds printed on them. Always birds. Once, Rick had remarked that Miss Oslansky looked like she'd been extruded from a school principal making machine. "We always do a unit on the Middle Ages," she said forlornly. "One is on the Black Death." "A unit on the Black Death?" Naomi repeated. She and the mothers of the Eleanors stared at each other's shoes. One of them looked as if she'd taken about 9 different sedatives. The other bit at her fingernails so vehemently she drew blood. Why did little kids need to learn about the Black Death? Why couldn't they learn about something cheerful, like what? Science had its cheerful topics, ladybugs and the eradication of disease and whatnot. But history was a toughie. The Inquisition, the Holocaust, Hiroshima, the Nixon presidency, slim pickings in the cheerfulness department. But if the curriculum was the Middle Ages, what about knights and nobles? Were knights and nobles cheerful? Knights wore chainmail, and chainmail brought her back to Glenn the gunman. Glenn the gunman had worn his chainmail as if for the battlefield, and his enemies were redheads and girls. His enemies were kids who still wet their beds, that ammonia smell wafting from her SpongeBob SquarePants sheets, and sucked their thumbs, and refused for months on end to eat anything but mashed potatoes and chocolate milk. Even if God was a total jerk, how could he set up such a one-sided matchup? Gunmen versus bedwetters? Heavily armed adult against thumbsuckers? Why couldn't jerk-face God direct Glenn the gunman to the middle of Kabul, where he could go head to blown-off head with a suicide bomber? Naomi thought about killing herself. "I kill me," she whispered as she watered Emily's African violet. But first, she would order a coffin for Emily. The obvious choice would be SpongeBob SquarePants, though Emily had also been fond for a while of a TV show called Pajanimals that featured animals learning valuable lessons by traveling to whimsical lands. She had especially liked a character named Cowbella, a miniature pink cow who always seemed to be wearing the same pair of purple pajamas. But that had been when Emily was much littler, hadn't it? Was it possible for a 7-year-old to have a period in her life when she was much littler? Naomi felt a burp of panic rise up in her. Soon, she would forget what her daughter liked to eat, how her voice sounded, how her peed-on sheets smelled. That was why she had to kill herself. If she didn't go to heaven, she would just end up in a coffin underground right next to Emily, and the two of them could rot together. But if she, in her atheist cynicism, had been wrong all along, she and Emily would meet up at the holy gates or wherever the crossroads of heaven were, wear gossamer robes or whatever angels wore, eat manna tacos from some Nirvanian food truck, bed down on a cloud. Naomi could braid Emily's red hair and make sure she learned about cheerful events in history, like Brown v. Board of Education and the Obama presidency. They could grow old together, or whatever you grew in heaven. Maybe you just grew wiser, and Emily could stay 7 forever. The coffin maker had an 800 number. Good job. It wasn't something clever like 180 dead kid. The grief counselor had told her she might struggle with a sense of unreality at times. At times? The grief counselor had told her to try to anticipate what might trigger feelings of grief. What wouldn't? Grief produces a wide range of responses. Everyone expresses grief in his or her own fashion, the counselor said. Really? Naomi wanted to ask. Wouldn't uncontrollable weeping and suicidal ideation be pretty common ways? What were the others? Did some grievers go out and play a few rounds of golf? Drink a Mai Tai and watch the sunset? Go to Best Buy and price laptops? Would you be okay if I weren't around? She asked Rick over almond butter on rice cakes for dinner. Neither of them had the presence of mind to cook, and they were between casserole deliveries from friends. If you went on vacation? Rick asked. In the context of Emily's death, the word seemed obscene, like eating dog meat in front of dogs. Sort of. More like a retreat. Naomi pictured her Hawaiian shirt turned into a noose, a nice New Mexico vista, before she drove off the cliff. I could manage for a little while. Okay, cool. She tried to bring up the custom coffin thing, but the words clogged her throat. Certain things you should never have to say. A woman answered the phone. How can we help? She asked. Naomi remembered a photo on the website of a woman with her hair dyed partly pink, the family liaison. I need a coffin, Naomi heard herself say. For my kid. Immediately she felt she sounded too definite, too businesslike. I should be crying, she thought. I should be keening, rending garments. Honey, how soon do you need it? The woman said gently. No giant rush, Naomi said. We were part of that school massacre. She trailed off, unsure what to say next. Which one? Which one? Had more than one lunatic mowed down bedwetters and thumbsuckers this week? Naomi hadn't been watching the news. Rick had thrown a towel over the television, and she hadn't summoned the energy to remove it. Utah or New Hampshire? Or was it Vermont? Utah? Naomi asked. Didn't they love kids in Utah? Didn't Utah have a law requiring you to have kids? New Hampshire, she said. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. He was the one in the chainmail, wasn't he? Not the Darth Vader. Not Darth Vader, Naomi said. He was the other one. Death is not the worst of evils. That's what General John Stark wrote after Live Free or Die to his comrades celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Bennington. He had a cold or something and couldn't go. Naomi had learned that in her 7th grade unit on the American Revolution. But you know what? Death actually was the worst of evils. Not your own death. Nope. That wasn't such a big song and dance. The worst of evils was your little girl's brains sprayed across the construction paper poster of the United States by some nut wearing chainmail and carrying his own personal arsenal into Plymouth Elementary School. The worst of evils was Wayne LaPierre crawling out of whatever swamp he lived in to decry the tragedy of gun-free zones, i.e., elementary schools. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Jillian and said she would take down some information about the child's final resting place. How old was your little angel? She asked. Naomi felt a zap in her gut, like she'd swallowed a live wasp. Emily was 7. 7 years and 3 months and 11 days and 4 hours. And what sort of theme are we thinking about? It could be anything, Naomi told herself. You can get a life-sized statue of Wayne LaPierre with his head shot off and his eyes poked out, roaches crawling out of his eye sockets, each roach with a little speaker attached to its back that played the words mea culpa over and over again. Wait, his head couldn't be shot off because that might be seen as condoning gun violence. Maybe a double life-size statue of Emily slicing his head off with a sword. That would be effective. All the news media in the entire world would cover the funeral. But Jesus, that would be exploiting the memory of her dead daughter. What the hell was wrong with her? What was she even thinking? I was thinking maybe Cowbella? We do Cowbella, Jillian said. We can do her with her buddies or without. Do you want the whole crew, squacky, the whole 9 yards? Definitely squacky. Maybe they could be singing Sleeping Makes Me Feel All Right, though it's a little extra for the audio. I'll spring for it, Naomi said. I'm gonna go pick up the coffin, she told Rick. They were eating another casserole. You want me to come along? I'll just whiz over and get it. Be back before you know. She didn't tell him it was in Texas, 2,038 miles away. She didn't tell him the coffin theme was pajanimals. She didn't tell him on the way she might take a sunset detour off a cliff. The next day, she loaded up a styrofoam cooler with kombucha tea and a lot of cheese. Since the massacre, cheese had given her more comfort than she would have imagined cheese capable of. Those French were onto something. Maybe if the chainmail guy and Wayne LaPierre got to eat more brie. Of course, Wayne LaPierre hadn't himself committed a gun massacre, but in his activist zeal, he seemed like kind of an advocate for gun massacres. All this enthusiasm over assault weapons was kind of unseemly, like a Christian showing up at Bergen-Belsen and saying, "What a great facility." Plymouth, New Hampshire, was 549 miles from the National Rifle Association headquarters. Naomi could do that distance in less than a workday. Not everyone knows that located beside the NRA HQ in Fairfax, Virginia, is a wheelchair-accessible shooting range open to the public. 15 shooting booths. More than 9 million bullets had been fired at the facility. Did people in wheelchairs actually come to shoot AK-47s at paper targets? She could go talk to that square-headed LaPierre himself, shove Emily's blood and brain-spattered denim jumper in his face. Maybe she should get herself a gun to bring in. Naomi, get your gun! And scare the bejesus out of everyone. Maybe she could dress in chainmail. Who knows, maybe they would welcome her if she showed herself to be one of them, a gun-toting mama with attitude. At a Cracker Barrel on I-95, Naomi wandered through the shop with its mason jars full of gumballs, its moon pies and horehound drops in paper sacks. Did anyone actually buy horehound drops in paper sacks? Its vintage bicycles and hacksaws hung from the ceiling. If Emily were here, she'd want the lollipop shaped like a giant mustache. Naomi had refused once to buy it for her. How could she have forbidden her daughter the simple pleasure of a mustache lollipop? A wave of such rage and self-recrimination washed over her that she had to dig her fingernails into her palms to prevent an urge to crack a jar full of gumballs against her skull. Go eat eggs, she told herself. She ate eggs. She played the triangular peg puzzle with the golf tees that sat next to the napkin dispenser. Emily had loved the peg puzzle. Why hadn't she bought Emily 400 peg puzzles, 400 mustache lollipops? And was that what grieving the death of a child in a consumer society came down to? Hating yourself for all the crap you'd refused to buy your kid when she was alive and nudging you? Fairfax was still 4 hours away. The FAQs page proved informative. Yes, gift cards in any denomination could be purchased. No on-site instructors were available to provide firearm instruction, though the answer to this FAQ mentioned helpfully that a bulletin board with contact information for private instructors was available. Naomi could get lessons in firearm use right in the belly of the beast, inside the holy temple of the right to shoot children at school itself. The facility was open 7 days a week. Some FAQs she didn't even understand. Does the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?